Greetings, programs, and welcome to the latest episode of Thumb Wars Presents Blistered Reviews. This time around, we're looking at the highly anticipated PS4 exclusive Infamous Second Son. Has the series successfully taken the next step forward in its evolution, or is this just a freak of nature deserving of only shunning and hatred?
Hey! You guys need any help? It's one of those freaks! Whoa! No! Oh, this fast healing stuff is gonna come in real handy. Reggie, I did this. And I gotta fix it.
I wish I could eat your cancer when you turn black. Hey, wait, I gotta make the blame. Forever is add to your price to survive. Hey, wait, I gotta make the blame. Forever is add to your price to survive.
For all that they featured people with extraordinary powers and high-octane conflicts with the fate of the world at stake, ultimately the original Infamous games were not really proper superhero tales, in my opinion. Instead, Infamous 1 and 2 together created a story that had more in common with modern-day urban fantasies and post-apocalyptic yarns than your typical tale of tights and capes. What's interesting then is just how much the opposite is true for Second Son, the latest entry in the Infamous series, which seems to reflect a deliberate effort on the part of developer Sucker Punch to bring the franchise more in line with the kinds of stories one would expect to find in, say, a mainline Marvel Universe comic. And in this case, at least, it's very much a change for the better. The good: story, characters, gameplay, boss fights, controls, visuals, audio. The bad: some awkward moral choices, repetitive side missions. The ugly: another Sucker Punch game, another heartbreaking evil ending. Infamous Second Son opened 7 years after the events of Infamous 2, taking the good ending as canon, and in the time since, the population of conduits, the series' name for superpowered individuals who can control and even weaponize such elements of electricity, fire, ice, and even more esoteric examples like paper and glass, has once again begun to grow, and is now strictly controlled by a government agency known as the Department of Unified Protection. The DUP has managed to not only successfully capture all known active conduits in the US, but is also responsible for the popularization of a new term for such individuals: bioterrorist. Interestingly, the DUP is actually led by a conduit, a woman named Brooke Augenstein, whose control of concrete has made her a formidable and nigh unstoppable figure, and who has even managed to develop the ability to share lesser versions of her powers with her men. Second Son cast players in the role of Washington-based Native American Delson Rowe, a fairly self-absorbed young man in his 20s whose path intersects with Augustine and the DUP on the day a prisoner transport carrying 3 powerful conduits crashes onto the reservation Delson and his brother, the local sheriff, call home. The conduits take advantage of the accident to escape to nearby Seattle, and along the way, Delson accidentally comes into direct contact with one of them, which triggers his own previously unknown conduit power, namely the ability to copy the abilities of other conduits. In the aftermath of this, Delson lapses into a week-long coma, during which Augustine's extreme measures leaves the majority of Delson's tribe crippled and dying from her destructive powers. Realizing that the only way to save the tribe is to copy Augustine's abilities in order to undo what she has done to them, Delson sets out for Seattle with his reluctant brother in tow. In a bid to capture the escaped prisoners, Augustine has declared martial law and cut the city off from the rest of civilization, effectively turning it into a lockdown military state in the process. Now, if Delson is going to achieve his goal, he's going to have to challenge the DUP head-on and recruit allies for a final confrontation with Augustine that will determine both his own future and that of conduits everywhere. While I remain a fan of the PS3-era Infamous games, I also have to admit that they struggled at times in terms of story and characterization. There were good ideas in the games, But a lack of proper execution, especially in terms of character development, and some ill-thought-out plot developments left the first game in the series something of a nearly incoherent mess at times. Infamous 2 was a step up over the original, and improved dramatically upon the previously weak characterization of lead Cole McGrath and his sidekick of sorts, Zeke. Still, the other characters in the game, especially the various nominal villains, still remained largely non-entities, and too much of the story in the first half of the game ultimately came across as filler. The game did at least feature a strong final quarter that led into a wonderfully effective finale, with the evil ending of the game in particular building to as legitimately upsetting and emotionally affecting of a climax as any game I played on the PS3. It really did seem like Sucker Punch were finally starting to get a handle on the series' story by the end of Infamous 2, and as it turns out, Second Son affirms this notion with a narrative that is dramatically improved over its predecessors on all fronts. For one thing, the plot in Second Son is a lot more straightforward, and lacks the more confusing and often counterintuitive elements such as time travel that weighed down the PS3 games. More than that, though, the game simply has much stronger thematic elements underlying its plot, including the issue of freedom versus security, and this in turn gives the story a bit more real-world weight than past Infamous efforts. Second Son also plays up the conduits versus human idea to an even larger extent than Infamous 2, and at times it almost feels like the greatest X-Men game never made, which is by no means a bad thing. Second Son additionally succeeds far better at populating its story with interesting and memorable characters, including Delson's brother and the escaped conduits who eventually Delson must recruit to his side. Even the game's main baddie, Augustine, is eventually revealed to be a more nuanced and complicated character than her seemingly over-the-top villainy in the game's opening hours would imply. Indeed, the motivations for why she's doing what she is doing actually makes a fair amount of twisted sense, and in the end, she stands as a surprisingly tragic figure in the vein of the best Marvel and DC villains. And then there's Delson, who starts Second Son as a fairly typical rebellious youth in his early 20s, and whose sardonic attitude and frequent one-liners while interacting with others remains reliably amusing throughout the events of the game. At the same time, as the story progresses, the weight of the events unfolding around Delson clearly begin to leave their mark on him, and one way or the other, he's a greatly changed man by the time the final credits roll. Exactly what direction these changes takes remains up to the players, thanks to the return of the morality system that has been a signature of the Infamous series from the beginning. Of course, this is also the same system that has been the source of major criticism previously, thanks in large part to its straightforward, black and white, this or that approach. In this case, though, considering that Second Son is very much a superhero tale, the employing of a fairly binary morality system actually makes more sense. It all ties back to the fact that such stories were originally designed as tales deliberately painted in primary colors and involving clashes between outright heroes and villains. I can appreciate the complaints of those who might wish that Second Son's story featured a middle-of-the-road option, where they could play the role of someone who's neither a villain nor a hero. And indeed, I generally approve of more nuanced moral choices in video games as a rule myself. However, in this case, including a gray path would not actually be keeping with the kind of story Sucker Punch have set out to tell. Far more so than any of the previous Infamous games, Second Son is a classic origin story of either a superhero or a supervillain in the making, and thus forcing Delson and the players firmly down one path or the other actually makes sense in this context. Furthermore, unlike in the past Infamous games, the big moral choices in Second Son feel more natural and keeping with Destin's established character, so that, for example, the good path in the game builds around Delson's realization of the consequences of his actions, which leads to a growing awareness of the larger world around him that in turn drives him to be the kind of man the people important to him can be proud of. Similarly, Delson's evil path revolves around the idea of a young man who has largely felt an outcast much of his life, becoming drunk on his own power as he simply tries to accomplish his goals with less and less concern for the collateral damage this brings about. In this way, the major moral decisions in Second Son come across as less arbitrary and forced, and I only wish I could say the same about the smaller moral choices built into the general gameplay that still too often fluctuate wildly and can leave Delson seemingly as a full-blown psycho despite his in-story behavior not matching this portrayal. I do think that the overall story of the game is strong enough to overcome such moments of weakness, but it's a sign nonetheless that Sucker Punch still has some kinks to work out in the formula. Regardless, Second Son is still a major step forward for the Infamous series in terms of narrative, and one that lays down a strong foundation for the series to build upon going forward. If Second Son's story then is the game's foundation, its gameplay is the building material that Sucker Punch uses to create one hell of a playground for players to enjoy messing around in. The developers have clearly learned from their previous efforts, and in particular, traversing the game world has seen some major refinements. Gone are the days where players would need to waste time trying to find handholds to let them climb back up to the rooftops, thanks to the fact that each of the power sets Delsin will eventually acquire includes its own unique methods of quick movement, including super speed, teleportation, gliding, and more. Players will truly feel like they have the power to go almost anywhere early on in Second Son, and it helps to make the simple act of exploring Seattle an enjoyable diversion in and of itself. The game's differing power sets also brings with them varying combat focuses, with Smoke featuring a mixture of melee and medium-range projectile abilities, while Neon offers long-range sniping and precision shooting through a time-slowdown mechanic, and Video lets players take a more stealthy approach thanks to invisibility and the ability to summon powerful NPC allies. Players can only have one power set active at a time, which allows for a clear delineation of abilities that in turn lets Sucker Punch avoid some of the more cumbersome and overly confusing control mapping issues that served as a major bane to the PS3 era Infamous games. With the controls smoothed out, combat in Second Son is the best the series has ever produced, which is good because combat really is a driving force behind the game. The races and other often extraneous mission types of past Infamous games have largely been greatly reduced or even outright removed, and in their place is a more limited selection of side activities for players to engage in. Seattle in Second Son has been divided into a number of districts, and once players have destroyed a given sector's mobile armored command vehicle, they'll unlock side missions ranging from tagging spots with graffiti using a surprisingly enjoyable motion-based minigame, to hunting down DUP spies and cameras hidden among the general population, and engaging in urban exploration in order to find audio diaries and recover blast shards from flying automated DUP drones. Doing all this contributes to weakening the DUP's hold on a sector, and if players work hard enough, they can eventually trigger a final battle for that sector against a large force of DUP troops that once won will drive the organization out of the sector for good and unlock a new fast travel point for players to make use of. Outside of story missions, this sequence of events is what makes up nearly the entirety of Second Son's side content, which in turn accounts for around half of the game's 20 to 30 hour running time. Personally, I had no problem with this because I found each of these activities remained enjoyable, even repeated numerous times, thanks to the game's strong controls and general design, but I can also see how some people's mileage might vary. In the game's defense, I will say that the setup for each mobile command vehicle, along with the final DUP showdown for a sector, varies dramatically in terms of general geographic layout and enemy makeup, and this helped let each of these encounters feel more unique than they otherwise might have. Also, the game's story missions offered players a lot of variety to balance out its arguably repetitious side material. This is especially true of Second Son's boss battles, which managed to present players with a wide variety of challenge, a terrific sense of escalation as the game progresses, and some amazing visual moments to really bring home that extra bit of epic. Speaking of visuals, Second Son is the first major release for either of the recently launched consoles designed explicitly from the start for the next generation, and it really shows. Climbing to a high spot in Second Son and seeing the entire game world and beyond laid out without any kind of visual trickery can be breathtaking, as is seeing the city lit up at night when rain pours down all around Delsin. Similarly, no matter how busy the action gets on the screen, there is nary a jot of slowdown, and players will likely be continually blown away with how much Sucker Punch has managed to draw out of the PS4 on their first go. Finally, Second Son features remarkably realistic and nuanced facial animations that puts even the just recently released Ground Zeroes to shame, and taken as a whole, it's clear that the PS4 is going to be very good to the open world genre in the years ahead. Put simply, the Seattle of Second Son is one of the most gorgeous environments ever to be featured in a video game, with terrific design aesthetic that includes a strong focus on color, combining with the technical power of the PS4 to create something truly remarkable. Orally, the game shines just as well, with strong vocal performances headlined by Troy Baker as Delson and Travis Willingham as his brother, and a terrific score that accents the action unfolding in the game perfectly. Overall, Second Son is not a game that pushes the open world genre in any particularly new directions, but instead takes the existing elements of it and perfects them in the same way that Super Mario World did for platformers back in the day. If you have any doubts about the potential of the PS4, or for that matter the appeal and viability of the infamous series, then playing this game should silence such concerns once and for all. This is such a competent and well put together game that it makes the original PS3 Infamous titles look like test runs in comparison. Silky smooth controls, extremely well designed gameplay, a strong story with memorable characters, and some of the best production values to ever grace a console game, all come together to make Second Son the very definition of a system seller, and one of the best first party titles Sony has ever published. Score, 9 out of 10, must own. Recommendation, buy it now.